You're delusional if you think we're staying with you in that cramped studio apartment." My stepdaughter Emma crossed her arms, her voice dripping with disdain. "We deserve better than living like peasants." My husband Marcus nodded in agreement, not even bothering to look up from his phone. "Sarah, be realistic. The kids need stability, not whatever fantasy you're chasing with your so-called writing career." What they didn't know was that 3 days ago, I had received a certified letter that would change everything. My eccentric great-aunt Millicent, whom the family had always called crazy, had left me her entire estate in Beacon Hill. The same mansion Marcus had been obsessing over for years, calling it his dream house. The irony was delicious. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning everything fell apart started like any other Tuesday in our tiny Boston studio. I was hunched over my laptop at our makeshift dining table, working on my latest freelance article about sustainable architecture, when Marcus burst through the door with his usual dramatic flair. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie askew, and his face carried that particular shade of frustration that meant his day had gone poorly. "Sarah, we need to talk." His tone was sharp, businesslike, the same voice he used when closing deals at his real estate firm. I glanced up from my screen, noting how he avoided eye contact. After 8 years of marriage, I had learned to read his moods like weather patterns, and this one promised a storm. "Of course, honey. What's on your mind?" I saved my work and closed the laptop, giving him my full attention despite the knot forming in my stomach. Marcus ran his fingers through his thinning hair, a nervous habit that had become more pronounced over the past year. "This isn't working anymore, Sarah. This whole arrangement, this lifestyle, none of it is sustainable." I felt my heart skip a beat, though part of me had been expecting this conversation for months. Our relationship had been deteriorating steadily since he'd been promoted to senior partner at Blackstone Realty. The success had changed him, made him more conscious of appearances, more concerned with what his colleagues thought of his struggling writer wife. What exactly isn't working? I kept my voice steady, professional, though my hands trembled slightly as I reached for my coffee mug. "Look around." Marcus gestured broadly at our modest studio apartment. "We're living in 600 square feet. My daughter Emma is 17 years old, and she doesn't even have her own room. My son Jake is starting high school next year, and he's embarrassed to bring friends over. This place is beneath us." The words stung because they weren't entirely unfair. Our apartment was small, cramped even, with a Murphy bed that doubled as our couch and a kitchen that consisted of a hot plate and mini fridge. But it was what we could afford on Marcus's salary, combined with my inconsistent freelance income. More importantly, it was temporary, or at least I had believed it was. "Marcus, we've talked about this. My writing career is finally gaining traction. I just landed that contract with Metropolitan Magazine, and the advance should help us move to a bigger place by Christmas." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sarah, you've been saying that for 3 years. Your writing career is a hobby that's bankrupting us. Do you have any idea how much I spend supporting your dream? The coffee shop sessions, the writing workshops, the endless supplies of notebooks and pens. Meanwhile, I'm working 60-hour weeks to keep us afloat." I opened my mouth to defend myself, to point out that my freelance work had contributed nearly $15,000 to our household income last year. But Marcus wasn't finished. "My kids deserve better than this. They deserve a real home, with real bedrooms and a backyard where they can invite friends over. They deserve a stepmother who contributes financially, instead of chasing fantasies." The casual cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow. Marcus had 2 children from his previous marriage, Emma and Jake, who lived with us full-time since their mother had moved to California for work. I had thrown myself into the role of stepmother with genuine enthusiasm, helping with homework, attending school events, cooking elaborate Sunday dinners despite our limited kitchen space. I thought I had been building something meaningful with them, but apparently love wasn't enough when measured against square footage and social status. Marcus continued his assault, his voice growing colder with each word. "Emma starts her senior year next month. She's already been accepted to Northeastern with a partial scholarship, but but she'll need to live at home to make it affordable. How do you think she feels knowing she'll be commuting from this shoebox while her classmates live in dormitories? I tried to speak to explain that we had been actively looking at larger apartments, that I had been working extra assignments to save for a deposit, but Marcus held up his hand to silence me. I've made a decision, Sarah. I'm putting in an offer on a house in Brookline. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a proper dining room where we can entertain clients. It's time I started living like the successful professional I am. My stomach dropped. Brooklyn was one of Boston's most expensive suburbs, filled with colonial mansions and manicured lawns that spoke of old money and established success. The kind of neighborhood where a house would cost at least $800,000. Probably more. Marcus, that's wonderful that you're thinking about our future, but shouldn't we discuss this together? Something that big affects all of us. He finally met my eyes, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. There was no warmth, no partnership, just calculation. Actually, Sarah, it doesn't affect all of us. The house is a 3-bedroom, and I need one for myself, one for Emma, and one for Jake. There isn't really space for someone who doesn't contribute to the mortgage. The words hung in the air between us like a verdict. I felt as though I was watching our marriage disintegrate in real time. 8 years of shared memories and whispered promises crumbling into financial spreadsheets and property values. What are you saying exactly? My voice came out smaller than I intended, barely above a whisper. I'm saying it's time for you to figure out your life, Sarah. If you want to keep playing writer, that's your choice, but I can't keep subsidizing it. My children come first, and they need stability. As if summoned by the mention of their names, Emma and Jake chose that moment to return from their after-school activities. Emma swept into the apartment with her usual theatrical flair, dropping her designer backpack on the floor with a loud thud. At 17, she had inherited Marcus's sharp features and his talent for cutting observations. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled despite the August heat, and her outfit probably cost more than I made in a week. Dad, please tell me you've finally come to your senses about this place. She gestured dismissively at our apartment. Jessica Morrison's family just bought a house in Newton, and it's absolutely gorgeous. Meanwhile, I'm too embarrassed to tell anyone where I live. Jake, 2 years younger but already showing signs of his father's ambition, nodded in agreement. The apartment complex doesn't even have a proper gym. How am I supposed to stay in shape for basketball tryouts? I watched this family that I had considered my own discuss my living situation, as though I wasn't sitting right there. The casual dismissal of my presence, my feelings, my contributions to our household, felt like a series of small deaths. Marcus smiled at his children with genuine warmth, the same expression that had made me fall in love with him years ago. Don't worry, kids. I found us the perfect house in Brookline. You'll each have your own room. And there's even a finished basement where Jake can set up a home gym. Emma clapped her hands together in delight. Really? Oh my God, Dad, you're the best.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
When do we move? I should be signing the papers next week. Marcus's eyes flicked toward me briefly before returning to his children. There are just a few details to work out first. The few details, of course, being how to extract himself from his marriage without looking like the villain in front of his children. I realized with crystalline clarity that this conversation had been carefully orchestrated. Marcus had already made his decision, probably weeks ago. He had found the house, calculated the finances, and determined that his life would be simpler without a struggling writer weighing him down. Where will Sarah live? Jake asked, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of hope that at least one person in this family still considered me part of it. Marcus's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Sarah is a grown woman. She'll figure something out. Maybe this will be the motivation she needs to finally get a real job. Emma snorted, a sound she had perfected to convey maximum disdain. No offense, Sarah, but it's probably for the best. You've been playing house for years, but you're not actually our mom. We need someone who can contribute to our future, not drain our resources. The words hit me like a physical slap. For 3 years, I had attended every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every basketball game. I had helped Emma with her college applications, spending hours editing her essays and researching scholarship opportunities. I had taught Jake to drive in our ancient Honda Civic, patiently enduring his teenage frustration and occasional outbursts. I had considered myself their stepmother in every way that mattered, but apparently biology and bank accounts mattered more. I felt something inside me fracture, but it wasn't heartbreak, it was something colder, cleaner. It was the recognition that these people had never truly valued me, that I had been convenient rather than loved. The realization was painful, but also liberating in a way I hadn't expected. You're absolutely right, Emma. I'm not your mother, and I never will be. I stood up from the table, my movements careful and controlled. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down. Marcus looked relieved that I wasn't going to fight him, that I was making this easy for him. See, Sarah understands that this is for the best. Sometimes people just grow in different directions. What Marcus didn't understand was that I wasn't conceding defeat. I was simply recognizing the battlefield for what it was. As I gathered my laptop and the few personal items scattered around the apartment, my mind was already working through the logistics of what came next. 3 days earlier, I had received a certified letter that I hadn't mentioned to anyone. The letter had been from the law offices of Pemberton, Chase & Associates, one of Boston's oldest and most prestigious firms. The envelope had been thick, expensive, with my name written in elegant script across the front. Inside, I had found a letter that began with the formal language of legal documents, but quickly became something extraordinary. My great-aunt, Millicent Ashworth, whom I had met only a handful of times at family gatherings, had passed away at the age of 93. She had been the black sheep of my mother's family, an unmarried woman who had spent her life traveling the world, collecting art, and making what my relatives considered eccentric investments. The family had always whispered about Aunt Millicent, with a mixture of affection and exasperation. She was the one who had scandalized everyone by refusing to marry the banker her parents had chosen for her, instead running off to Paris in the 1950s to study art. She was the one who had bought property in neighborhoods that were considered questionable at the time, but later became highly sought after. She was the one who had invested in unknown artists whose work now hung in major museums. Most importantly, she was the one who had somehow managed to acquire a stunning mansion in Beacon Hill, one of Boston's most exclusive neighborhoods. The same mansion that Marcus had pointed out during our Sunday walks, calling it his dream house, fantasizing about what it would be like to live in such grandeur. According to the letter, Aunt Millicent had left me everything. The house, the art collection, the investment portfolio, even her vintage Jaguar that she had somehow managed to keep running for 40 years. The lawyer, Mr. Pemberton himself, had requested a meeting to discuss the details of the inheritance, but the letter had been clear. I was now the sole owner of an estate worth approximately $12 million. I hadn't told Marcus about the letter because I had needed time to process it myself. Aunt Millicent and I had exchanged Christmas cards and the occasional phone call, but I had never expected to be remembered in her will, much less to inherit everything. The letter had explained that she had been following my writing career with interest, that she admired my determination to pursue my passion, despite the lack of immediate financial reward. She had included a handwritten note with the legal documents, her spidery handwriting difficult to read but unmistakably hers. Dear Sarah, I have watched you struggle to maintain your authentic self in a world that values conformity over creativity. You remind me of myself at your age, determined to live life on your own terms despite the pressure to settle for less. Use this inheritance not just to secure your future, but to continue being brave enough to chase your dreams. The world needs more people who refuse to compromise their souls for the sake of convenience. With love and admiration, Aunt Millicent. As I packed my belongings into 2 small suitcases, I thought about that note and what it meant. Aunt Millicent had seen something in me that even I hadn't recognized, a strength that had been hidden beneath years of trying to fit into Marcus's vision of what I should be. Marcus was in the kitchen, opening a bottle of wine to celebrate his newfound freedom, while Emma and Jake argued over who would get the bigger bedroom in their new house. None of them paid attention as I moved quietly around the apartment, gathering the few possessions that truly belonged to me. I didn't take the wedding china that Marcus's mother had given us, or the expensive coffee maker that had been a joint purchase, or any of the books we had bought together over the years. I took only what was undeniably mine. My laptop, my notebooks filled with story ideas and half-finished articles, my grandmother's jewelry, and the small collection of vintage photographs that I had inherited from my parents. When I was finished packing, I stood in the doorway of what had been our home for 3 years, looking at this family that had never truly accepted me. Marcus was explaining to his children how much their lives were about to improve, how they would finally be able to live in a style befitting their social status. Emma was already planning how she would redecorate her new room, while Jake was calculating how much space he would have for his workout equipment. "Sarah, you don't have to leave tonight." Marcus's voice carried a note of magnanimous generosity, as though he was doing me a tremendous favor. "You can stay until you find somewhere else to go." I'm not heartless. The irony of his statement wasn't lost on me. This man who was discarding me like an unwanted piece of furniture was congratulating himself on his compassion, because he wasn't literally throwing me out on the street. "That's very kind of you, Marcus, but I think a clean break is better for everyone." I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the Uber app. "I'll be fine." Emma looked up from her phone, where she had been researching furniture for her future bedroom. "Where will you even go? It's not like you have family money to fall back on." The question hung in the air, and I could see the curiosity in all their faces. They were expecting me to break down, to beg for mercy, to reveal some desperate plan involving cheap motels or charity from distant relatives. Instead, I smiled. "I'll figure something out. I always do." The Uber notification chimed on my phone, letting me know my driver had arrived. I picked up my suitcases, surprised by how light they felt, how little I actually needed from this life I was leaving behind. "Sarah, wait." Jake's voice stopped me at the door. For a moment, I thought he might say something kind, something that acknowledged the 3 years I had spent caring for him. Instead, he held up a $20 bill. "Here's some money for the ride. I don't want you to think we're completely heartless." The casual condescension of the gesture, the assumption that I needed their charity, crystallized everything I had been feeling into a moment of perfect clarity. I looked at this boy I had helped raise, this family I had loved and supported and sacrificed for, and felt nothing but pity for their inability to see beyond their own narrow worldview. "Keep your money, Jake. I'll be just fine." I closed the door behind me with a soft click, leaving behind 8 years of marriage and 3 years of trying to be someone I was never meant to be. The Uber driver, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, helped me load my suitcases into her trunk. "Rough day?" she asked as we pulled away from the apartment complex. I looked back at the building where Marcus and his children were probably already planning their new life without me, and smiled. "Actually, I think it's about to get much better." The next morning, I stood in the marble lobby of Pemberton Chase & Associates, wearing my best dress and carrying a leather portfolio that contained all the legal documents I had received. The building itself was a testament to old Boston money, with oil paintings of stern-faced men in judicial robes and Persian rugs that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. Mr. Pemberton was exactly what I had expected from a senior partner at one of the city's most prestigious law firms. He was probably in his 70s, with silver hair and the kind of expensive suit that whispered rather than shouted its quality. His office overlooked Boston Common, and the walls were lined with law books that looked as though they had been bound in leather sometime during the previous century. "Miss Ashworth, please have a seat." His voice carried the cultured tones of someone who had attended the right schools and moved in the right circles his entire life. "I trust you've had time to review the documents we sent?" I nodded, settling into a chair that was probably worth more than my monthly rent. "I have to admit, Mr. Pemberton, this all feels rather surreal. I had no idea Aunt Millicent was even aware of my existence, much less that she would remember me in her will." He smiled, the first genuine warmth I had seen from him. "Your great-aunt was a remarkable woman, Miss Ashworth. She spoke of you often during our meetings over the years. She was quite proud of your writing career and your determination to pursue your passion despite the, shall we say, practical challenges." I felt a warmth spread through my chest at his words. It meant more than I could express to know that someone had been watching my struggles with pride rather than disappointment. Mr. Pemberton opened a thick folder and spread several documents across his desk. "Now then, let's discuss the specifics of your inheritance. The house itself is located at 47 Beacon Street, which I'm sure you know is one of the most prestigious addresses in the city. It's a 4-story Victorian mansion built in 1887, with 6 bedrooms, 4.5 bathrooms, and all the original architectural details intact. He handed me a folder containing professional photographs of the property, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I had seen the house from the outside during my walks with Marcus, but these photos revealed the interior in all its glory. Soaring ceilings with ornate molding, marble fireplaces, hardwood floors that gleamed like honey, and windows that flooded the rooms with natural light. The property has been meticulously maintained over the years. Your great-aunt invested heavily in updates and renovations, always ensuring that modern conveniences were added without compromising the historical integrity of the structure. I flipped through the photos, each one more stunning than the last. There was a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a rolling ladder, a formal dining room with a crystal chandelier, a kitchen that had been updated with professional-grade appliances, while maintaining its Victorian charm. The art collection alone is worth approximately $3 million. Mr. Pemberton continued. Your great-aunt had an exceptional eye for emerging talent, and several pieces have appreciated significantly since their purchase. $3 million. The number was so far beyond my comprehension that it felt abstract, like a figure from a movie, rather than my actual life. The investment portfolio is quite diverse and well managed. Conservative estimates place its current value at approximately $4 million, though the markets have been favorable lately. I set down the photographs and looked at Mr. Pemberton directly. I have to ask, why me? I mean, I'm grateful beyond words, but I hardly knew Aunt Millicent. Surely there were other family members who had stronger relationships with her. He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Your great-aunt was quite specific about her reasoning, Miss Ashworth. She felt that you were the only family member who shared her values, her willingness to prioritize personal fulfillment over societal expectations. She mentioned that you had chosen to pursue writing despite pressure to choose a more financially secure career path. The irony wasn't lost on me. Yesterday, I had been lectured about my impractical career choice, and today I was being rewarded for it by someone who had understood its value all along. She also mentioned that she had been following your published work and was impressed by your talent and persistence. Your great-aunt believed that you would use this inheritance wisely, that you would honor both the legacy of the property and the spirit in which it was given. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. It was overwhelming to realize that someone had been believing in me all along, someone who had seen my potential even when I had struggled to see it myself. There are a few conditions to the inheritance, Mr. Pemberton continued. Nothing onerous, but your great-aunt was quite specific about her wishes. First, the house must remain your primary residence for at least 5 years. She felt strongly that it should be lived in and loved, not simply sold for profit. That was hardly a hardship. Living in one of Boston's most beautiful mansions for 5 years would be a dream come true, not a burden. Second, she has requested that you continue her tradition of supporting emerging artists. There's a separate fund of $500,000 specifically designated for this purpose. You have complete discretion over how to use it, but she hoped you would consider establishing grants or scholarships for young artists and writers. The generosity of the gesture was breathtaking. Not only was Aunt Millicent giving me financial security, but she was also providing me with the means to help others pursue their dreams. Finally, she has included a personal request that you maintain the garden. She was quite proud of her roses and hoped that someone in the family would continue caring for them. I laughed despite the tears that were now flowing freely down my cheeks. Of course she would want me to take care of her roses. It was such a perfectly personal touch, such a reminder that this inheritance wasn't just about money or property, but about connection and continuity. When can I see the house? The words tumbled out before I could stop them, my excitement overriding any attempt at dignity. Mr. Pemberton smiled. Whenever you'd like, Miss Ashworth. The property is yours, as of this morning. He handed me an ornate brass key that looked like something from a fairy tale. This is the original key to the front door. Your great-aunt insisted that it be presented to you personally, rather than simply mailed with the documents. I held the key in my palm, feeling its weight and warmth, and realized that this small piece of metal represented more than just access to a house. It represented freedom, opportunity, and the validation that I had been seeking my entire adult life. Is there anything else I need to know? Any other legal requirements or restrictions? Mr. Pemberton shook his head. The inheritance is quite straightforward, Miss Ashworth. The property taxes are current, all utilities are in working order, and there's even a small staff that your great-aunt employed to maintain the house and gardens. They're hoping to continue working for you, though of course that's entirely your decision. A staff. I was going to have a staff. The concept was so foreign to my experience that I almost laughed out loud. Yesterday, I had been living in a studio apartment where I did my own cleaning and cooking, and today I was inheriting a mansion with employees. I think I'd like to see the house now, if that's possible. Mr. Pemberton stood up and walked me to the door of his office. Certainly. And Miss Ashworth? Your great-aunt would be very pleased to know that her faith in you was well placed. I have a feeling you're going to do wonderful things with this opportunity. An hour later, I stood on the sidewalk in front of 47 Beacon Street, looking up at what was now my home. The mansion was even more impressive up close than it had appeared in the photographs. 4 stories of red brick and limestone, with bay windows and a slate roof that spoke of craftsmanship from an era when such details mattered. The front garden was immaculate, with carefully tended roses blooming in shades of pink and white. I climbed the steps to the front door, each one bringing me closer to a life I had never dared to imagine. The brass key slid into the lock smoothly, as though it had been waiting for this moment. The door opened with a satisfying weight, revealing an entrance hall that took my breath away. The foyer was dominated by a grand staircase that curved gracefully toward the upper floors. The walls were covered in silk wallpaper in a deep emerald green, and oil paintings in gilded frames provided splashes of color and history. A crystal chandelier hung from the coffered ceiling, casting rainbow prisms across the polished marble floor. "Miss Sarah?" A voice called from somewhere deeper in the house, and a moment later, a woman appeared who looked to be in her 60s. She had silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and wore a simple but elegant dress that suggested she was probably the housekeeper. "I'm Mrs. Chen, the house manager. We've been expecting you." The warmth in her voice was immediate and genuine, and I felt some of the overwhelming nature of the situation begin to settle into something more manageable. "Mrs. Chen, it's wonderful to meet you. I'm still trying to process all of this, to be honest." She smiled understandingly. "Miss Millicent spoke of you often, especially in recent months. She was very excited about the prospect of you living here, of bringing new energy to the house." Mrs. Chen led me through the main floor, pointing out the various rooms and their features. The formal living room with its marble fireplace and Persian rugs, the dining room with seating for 12, the library that was even more impressive in person than it had appeared in photographs. "This was Miss Millicent's favorite room," Mrs. Chen said as we entered the library. She spent most of her mornings here, reading and corresponding with art dealers and gallery owners around the world. I ran my fingers along the spines of leather-bound books, many of them first editions, and felt a connection to this woman I had barely known, but who had somehow understood me better than the people I lived with every day. The kitchen was a perfect blend of historical charm and modern convenience. The original brick walls and beamed ceiling had been preserved, but the appliances were state-of-the-art. A large island provided workspace and storage, and windows overlooking the back garden filled the room with natural light. Mrs. Chen explained that there were 2 other staff members, Mr. Patterson, who maintained the gardens and handled minor repairs, and Maria, who came 3 times a week to help with cleaning and laundry. All of them had worked for Aunt Millicent for over a decade, and were hoping to continue their employment. "Of course," I said quickly. "I can't imagine maintaining this place without professional help, and Aunt Millicent obviously trusted you all completely." The relief on Mrs. Chen's face was evident. "We were worried that you might want to bring in your own people, or that you might decide to sell the property. No chance of that." I looked around the kitchen, imagining myself cooking breakfast at the huge island, hosting dinner parties in the formal dining room, writing in the library surrounded by centuries of literature. This is going to be my home. We climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, where Mrs. Chen showed me the master bedroom suite. It was easily 3 times the size of the entire studio apartment I had shared with Marcus, with a sitting area, a walk-in closet that was bigger than most bedrooms, and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub that overlooked the garden. The third floor contained 3 additional bedrooms, each beautifully appointed and offering different views of the city. The fourth floor had been converted into an artist's studio, with skylights and easels and canvases stacked against the walls. Miss Millicent used this space for her painting, Mrs. Chen explained. She wasn't professionally trained, but she found it relaxing. She always said that everyone should have a creative outlet. I stood in the middle of the studio, surrounded by evidence of Aunt Millicent's artistic pursuits, and felt a profound sense of coming home. This wasn't just a house I had inherited, it was a sanctuary that had been specifically designed for someone like me, someone who valued beauty and creativity and the freedom to pursue personal passions. Mrs. Chen, would it be possible for me to move in today? I know it's short notice, but I'm currently between living situations. She looked surprised but pleased. Of course, Miss Sarah. The house is fully prepared for occupancy. Miss Millicent always insisted that it be kept ready for guests, though she rarely entertained in recent years. I pulled out my phone and called another Uber, this time to collect the rest of my belongings from the studio apartment. It would probably take all of 10 minutes to pack everything I owned, a fact that should have been depressing but instead felt liberating. While I waited for the car to arrive, I walked through the house again, this time moving more slowly and trying to absorb the reality of my situation. Less than 24 hours ago, I had been a struggling writer living in a cramped apartment with a man who saw me as a financial burden. Now I was the owner of a $12 million estate in one of Boston's most exclusive neighborhoods. The emotional whiplash was intense, but underneath the shock and disbelief, I felt something else, a deep sense of rightness, as though this was always how things were supposed to unfold. Aunt Millicent had seen something in me that even I hadn't recognized, and she had given me not just financial security but the opportunity to become the person I was meant to be. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. "Sarah, I hope you're not being dramatic about this. The kids are asking when you'll be back to make dinner." The casual assumption that I would return, that yesterday's conversation had been nothing more than a temporary tantrum, was breathtaking in its arrogance. He genuinely believed that I had nowhere else to go, that I would come crawling back because I had no other options. I typed back, "Don't worry about me. I'm exactly where I need to be." His response was immediate. "Where are you staying? Sarah, be realistic. You can't afford a hotel indefinitely." I looked around the marble foyer of my mansion, at the crystal chandelier and silk wallpaper and oil paintings, and smiled as I typed my response. "I'm staying with family." It wasn't technically a lie. Aunt Millicent had been family, and this house was her gift to me. But I knew Marcus would assume I was imposing on some distant relative, staying in a guest room and trying to figure out my next move. His final text was exactly what I had expected. "Fine. When you're ready to be an adult about this, you know where to find me. When I'm ready to be an adult." The phrase perfectly encapsulated everything that had been wrong with our relationship. Marcus had never seen me as an equal partner, but rather as a child who needed guidance and correction. My dreams were childish, my career was a hobby, my contributions to our household were insignificant. The Uber arrived to take me back to the studio apartment one last time. During the ride, I found myself thinking about Emma's question from the night before. "Where will you even go?" She had asked it with such certainty that I had no viable options, such confidence that I would be forced to accept whatever scraps of charity they might offer. The apartment felt even smaller when I returned to it, cramped and dingy compared to the spacious elegance I had just left. Marcus was at work, and the kids were at their respective activities, so I was able to pack quickly and efficiently without having to endure any more condescending conversations about my prospects. I left behind anything that felt like it belonged to our shared life together. The books we had bought jointly, the kitchen gadgets we had received as wedding gifts, even some clothes that Marcus had bought for me over the years. I wanted to start fresh, to build a new life from authentic pieces rather than remnants of who I had been trying to be. There was one item I almost forgot. The manila envelope containing all the documents related to my inheritance. It was sitting on the small desk where I had hidden it 3 days earlier, not ready to share the news with Marcus until I had processed it myself. Now I realized how wise that instinct had been. If Marcus had known about the inheritance, yesterday's conversation would have gone very differently. Instead of dismissing me as a financial burden, he would have tried to convince me that we could work things out, that our marriage was worth saving. But it wasn't worth saving, and it never had been. I had spent 8 years trying to make myself smaller, quieter, more convenient for a man who fundamentally didn't respect who I was. The inheritance hadn't changed who I was. It had simply revealed who I had always been underneath the compromises and accommodations. I left my key on the kitchen counter along with a brief note. Marcus, thank you for showing me what I don't want in a partner. I hope you and the children are very happy in your new house. Sarah. The ride back to Beacon Street felt like traveling between two different worlds. The cramped studio apartment with its Murphy bed and hot plate represented the life I had been living, the person I had been trying to be. The mansion with its grand staircase and crystal chandeliers represented possibility, the person I was meant to become. Mrs. Chen was waiting when I arrived, and she had clearly been busy during my absence. Fresh flowers had been arranged in several rooms, the kitchen was stocked with groceries, and my bedroom had been prepared with fresh linens and towels. I thought you might be hungry after such an eventful day, she said, leading me to the kitchen where she had prepared a simple but elegant dinner of grilled salmon and roasted vegetables. Sitting at the kitchen island, eating food that someone else had prepared in a house that I owned, I felt the full reality of my situation begin to sink in. I was no longer dependent on anyone else's goodwill or financial support. I had my own home, my own resources, my own life to build from scratch. Mrs. Chen, what was Aunt Millicent like? I realized I wanted to know more about this woman who had given me such an extraordinary gift. She sat down across from me with a cup of tea, her expression thoughtful. Miss Millicent was remarkable, Miss Sarah. She lived life entirely on her own terms, which wasn't easy for a woman of her generation. She never married because she refused to settle for someone who didn't understand her passion for art and travel. She spent her 20s in Europe, studying painting and collecting pieces from artists who were just starting their careers. Many people thought she was foolish for spending her inheritance on unknown artists, but she had an incredible eye for talent. Mrs. Chen's voice carried obvious affection as she continued. She came back to Boston in her 30s and bought this house, which was considered quite scandalous at the time. A single woman owning such a grand property was almost unheard of. But Miss Millicent never cared what other people thought. She hosted salons here, bringing together artists and writers and intellectuals. Some of the most important cultural conversations in Boston happened in this very dining room. I tried to imagine the house filled with creative energy, animated conversations about art and literature flowing through these elegant rooms. It felt like the perfect environment for someone like me, someone who had always felt most alive when surrounded by books and ideas. She never stopped believing in people's potential, Mrs. Chen added. Even when her own family criticized her choices, she remained true to her values. She used to say that the world needed more people who were brave enough to live authentically, regardless of the cost. The parallels to my own situation weren't lost on me. Like Aunt Millicent, I had been criticized for prioritizing my passion over practical considerations. Like her, I had been viewed as impractical and naive by people who measured success purely in financial terms. After dinner, I spent the evening exploring the house more thoroughly, discovering details that I had missed during my initial tour. The library contained not just classic literature but also contemporary works by authors I had never heard of, many of them signed with personal inscriptions to Aunt Millicent. She had clearly maintained relationships with writers and artists throughout her life, supporting their work and celebrating their achievements. In the master bedroom, I found a leather-bound journal on the nightstand. The first entry was dated just 3 months ago, written in Aunt Millicent's distinctive handwriting. I have been thinking about legacy lately, about what we leave behind when we're gone. I have no children, no direct descendants to carry on my name or my values, but I have been watching Sarah from afar, reading her articles and following her career with great interest. She reminds me so much of myself at her age, determined to pursue her art despite the pressure to choose a more conventional path. I think she might be the one to continue what I started here, to keep this house alive with creativity and purpose. The entry continued for several pages, detailing Aunt Millicent's observations about my writing and her hopes for my future. It was overwhelming to realize that someone had been paying such close attention to my work, finding value in efforts that others dismissed as impractical. She had written about Marcus as well, noting her concerns about his influence on my career and his apparent lack of appreciation for my talents. Her assessment was remarkably accurate for someone who had never met him personally. I worry that Sarah is allowing others to define her worth, that she is compromising her authentic self to maintain relationships that don't serve her growth. I hope that by leaving her this house, I can give her the freedom and security she needs to fully embrace her potential. Reading those words, I felt a profound sense of connection to this woman I had barely known but who had understood me better than people I had lived with for years. Aunt Millicent had seen my potential when I had struggled to see it myself, and she had taken action to ensure that I would have the opportunity to realize it. I fell asleep that night in the master bedroom, surrounded by luxury that still felt surreal. The bed was enormous and incredibly comfortable, with Egyptian cotton sheets and down pillows that felt like sleeping on clouds. Through the windows, I could see the lights of Boston Common and the city beyond, a view that reminded me I was now part of this historic neighborhood, this community of people who had shaped the cultural landscape of the city. When I woke the next morning, it took me several moments to remember where I was. Sunlight was streaming through the tall windows, and I could hear birds singing in the garden below. Mrs. Chen had left coffee and fresh pastries in the kitchen, along with a note explaining that she would be shopping for groceries and would return in the afternoon. I spent the morning writing in the library, working on an article about historic preservation that had taken on new meaning given my current circumstances. Being surrounded by so much beauty and history inspired me in ways I hadn't expected. My words flowed more easily than they had in months, and I found myself writing with a confidence and authority that had been missing from my recent work. Around noon, my phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and I debated whether to answer. Part of me was curious about what he would say, whether he had realized yet that I wasn't coming back. "Sarah, what the hell is going on?" His voice was sharp with frustration. "Emma said you left some cryptic note about staying with family, but your mother hasn't heard from you. Where are you?" "I'm exactly where I said I would be, Marcus." "I'm staying with family." "What family?" "Your parents live in Florida and your sister is in California. Who could you possibly be staying with?" I smiled, enjoying his confusion more than I probably should have. "I told you. I'm fine. You don't need to worry about me." "Sarah, this is ridiculous. You can't just disappear without telling me where you are. We're still married, legally speaking. I have a right to know." The audacity of his statement was breathtaking. Yesterday he had been planning to buy a house without space for me, and today he was asserting his rights as my husband. "Marcus, you made it very clear yesterday that our marriage is over. You told me there wasn't room for me in your new life, remember? So no, you don't have a right to know anything about my current situation. Look, maybe I was hasty yesterday. The kids were pressuring me about the house, and I let the stress get to me. We can work this out, Sarah. We don't have to rush into anything." His tone had shifted from demanding to wheedling, and I realized he was probably calculating the cost of divorce lawyers and alimony payments. Marcus had always been practical about money, and he was likely realizing that discarding me might be more expensive than he had initially assumed. "I appreciate the sentiment, Marcus, but I think you were right the first time. We want different things from life, and it's better that we both acknowledge that now." Emma's voice interrupted in the background, clearly listening to his side of the conversation. "Dad, ask her when she's coming back to get her stuff. I want to start redecorating her side of the closet." The casual cruelty of the comment crystallized everything I needed to know about how this family truly viewed me. I wasn't a person whose feelings mattered. I was an inconvenience to be managed and dismissed. "You can donate anything I left behind, Marcus. I don't need any of it." "What do you mean, donate?" "Sarah, you're talking crazy. You need your clothes, your books, your personal items." "I really don't. I'm starting fresh." The line was quiet for a long moment, and I could almost hear Marcus trying to process this information. The Sarah he knew was practical and cautious, someone who would never abandon her possessions or make dramatic gestures. "Sarah, I'm worried about you. This doesn't sound like you at all. Maybe you should talk to someone, a counselor or therapist. This whole situation has clearly been more stressful than any of us realized." The suggestion that I needed professional help because I was refusing to accept his rejection was perfectly characteristic of Marcus's worldview. In his mind, any woman who didn't desperately want to remain married to him must be mentally unstable. "I'm perfectly fine, Marcus. In fact, I'm better than I've been in years. You should focus on your new house and your new life. I'm sure you'll be very happy." Before he could respond, I hung up and immediately blocked his number. I had no interest in continuing conversations that served no purpose other than to feed his ego or assuage his guilt. The next few days passed in a blur of discovery and adjustment. I explored every room of the house, finding hidden treasures and learning about Aunt Millicent's life through the objects she had collected. There was a closet full of vintage designer clothing, much of it from her travels in Europe during the 1950s and 60s. There was a wine cellar containing bottles that were probably worth more than I had made in entire years. There was even a small conservatory off the back of the house filled with orchids and exotic plants that Mrs. Chen tended with obvious expertise. Each discovery reinforced my sense that this inheritance was about more than money or property. Aunt Millicent had created a life of intentional beauty, surrounding herself with art and literature and experiences that fed her soul. The house itself was a testament to the idea that one could live well by prioritizing quality over quantity, meaning over materialism. I also began to understand the scope of my financial situation more clearly. The investment portfolio that Mr. Pemberton had mentioned was managed by a firm that specialized in socially responsible investing, with holdings in companies that aligned with Aunt Millicent's values. The art collection included pieces by artists who had become quite famous since she had purchased their work decades earlier. More importantly, I began to grasp the freedom that this inheritance represented. For the first time in my adult life, I could make decisions based on what I wanted, rather than what I could afford. I could write the stories that mattered to me, rather than accepting whatever assignments paid the bills. I could travel, learn new skills, explore interests that I had set aside for practical reasons. A week after moving into the house, I was working in the library when Mrs. Chen announced that I had visitors. Emma and Jake were standing in the foyer, looking around with obvious amazement. They had clearly not expected to find me living in such grandeur. "Sarah, what the hell is this place?" Emma's voice carried a mixture of shock and accusation, as though I had somehow deceived them by not revealing my secret wealth earlier. "This is where I'm staying." I kept my tone neutral, professional, offering no explanations or justifications. Jake was turning in slow circles, trying to take in the full scope of the entrance hall. "This is insane. How can you afford to live here?" "Dad said you don't have any money." "Things change, Jake." Emma's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Whose house is this really? Are you working as a live-in housekeeper or something? Because there's no way you could afford to rent a place like this, much less own it." Her assumption that I must be an employee rather than the owner was perfectly characteristic of how she had always viewed me. In Emma's worldview, people like me didn't live in houses like this unless we were serving people who did. "Actually, Emma, this is my house. I inherited it from my great-aunt." The siblings exchanged glances, clearly struggling to process this information. Emma recovered first, her voice sharp with disbelief. "That's impossible. Dad said your family doesn't have money. He said that's why you were so desperate to marry him, because you needed financial security." The casual cruelty of her statement, the implication that my marriage to her father had been motivated by gold digging rather than love, stung more than I cared to admit. But it also revealed how Marcus had characterized our relationship to his children, painting me as an opportunist rather than a partner. "Your father's understanding of my family's financial situation was incomplete." I chose not to elaborate, enjoying their obvious confusion and frustration. Jake was still staring at the chandelier, the oil paintings, the marble floors. "If you're this rich, why were you living in that tiny apartment with us? Why didn't you just buy your own place?" It was a fair question, one that I had been asking myself since the inheritance. The truth was complicated, involving years of trying to fit into Marcus's vision of appropriate behavior for a wife, of prioritizing our relationship over my own comfort and independence. Sometimes we make choices that don't serve us well, Jake. Sometimes we learn that lesson later than we should. Emma was treasures and learning about Aunt Millicent's life through the objects she had collected. There was a closet full of vintage designer clothing, much of it from her travels in Europe during the 1950s and 60s. There was a wine cellar containing bottles that were probably worth more than I had made in entire years. There was even a small conservatory off the back of the house filled with orchids and exotic plants that Mrs. Chen tended with obvious expertise. Each discovery reinforced my sense that this inheritance was about more than money or property. Aunt Millicent had created a life of intentional beauty, surrounding herself with art and literature and experiences that fed her soul. The house itself was a testament to the idea that one could live well by prioritizing quality over quantity, meaning over materialism. I also began to understand the scope of my financial situation more clearly. The investment portfolio that Mr. Pemberton had mentioned was managed by a firm that specialized in socially responsible investing, with holdings in companies that aligned with Aunt Millicent's values. The art collection included pieces by artists who had become quite famous since she had purchased their work decades earlier. More importantly, I began to grasp the freedom that this inheritance represented. For the first time in my adult life, I could make decisions based on what I wanted, rather than what I could afford. I could write the stories that mattered to me, rather than accepting whatever assignments paid the bills. I could travel, learn new skills, explore interests that I had set aside for practical reasons. A week after moving into the house, I was working in the library when Mrs. Chen announced that I had visitors. Emma and Jake were standing in the foyer, looking around with obvious amazement. They had clearly not expected to find me living in such grandeur. "Sarah, what the hell is this place?" Emma's voice carried a mixture of shock and accusation, as though I had somehow deceived them by not revealing my secret wealth earlier. "This is where I'm staying." I kept my tone neutral, professional, offering no explanations or justifications. Jake was turning in slow circles, trying to take in the full scope of the entrance hall. "This is insane. How can you afford to live here?" "Dad said you don't have any money." "Things change, Jake." Emma's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Whose house is this really? Are you working as a live-in housekeeper or something? Because there's no way you could afford to rent a place like this, much less own it." Her assumption that I must be an employee rather than the owner was perfectly characteristic of how she had always viewed me. In Emma's worldview, people like me didn't live in houses like this unless we were serving people who did. "Actually, Emma, this is my house. I inherited it from my great-aunt." The siblings exchanged glances, clearly struggling to process this information. Emma recovered first, her voice sharp with disbelief. "That's impossible. Dad said your family doesn't have money. He said that's why you were so desperate to marry him, because you needed financial security." The casual cruelty of her statement, the implication that my marriage to her father had been motivated by gold digging rather than love, stung more than I cared to admit. But it also revealed how Marcus had characterized our relationship to his children, painting me as an opportunist rather than a partner. "Your father's understanding of my family's financial situation was incomplete." I chose not to elaborate, enjoying their obvious confusion and frustration. Jake was still staring at the chandelier, the oil paintings, the marble floors. "If you're this rich, why were you living in that tiny apartment with us? Why didn't you just buy your own place?" It was a fair question, one that I had been asking myself since the inheritance. The truth was complicated, involving years of trying to fit into Marcus's vision of appropriate behavior for a wife, of prioritizing our relationship over my own comfort and independence. Sometimes we make choices that don't serve us well, Jake. Sometimes we learn that lesson later than we should. Emma was, "Relationships truly serve our growth and happiness." The wisdom of that observation struck me deeply. I had been born into a loving family, but my parents lived across the country and I saw them rarely. I had chosen Marcus and his children as my second family, but that choice had been based on compromise rather than compatibility, convenience rather than genuine connection. Now I had the opportunity to choose again to build relationships based on mutual respect and shared values rather than obligation or need. That afternoon I received an unexpected phone call from an unknown Boston number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Miss Ashworth, this is Rebecca Martinez from Boston Metropolitan Magazine. I hope I'm not calling it a bad time." I recognized the name immediately. Rebecca Martinez was one of the most respected editors in Boston's publishing scene, known for her work with emerging writers and her commitment to literary excellence. Not at all, Ms. Martinez. How can I help you? I've been following your work for some time, particularly your recent pieces on urban development and historic preservation. Your writing demonstrates exactly the kind of insight and depth we're looking for at Metropolitan. I felt a thrill of excitement mixed with nervousness. Metropolitan magazine was one of the most prestigious publications in New England, known for its thoughtful cultural coverage and high editorial standards. We're launching a new series on Boston's hidden histories, focusing on the stories behind some of the city's most iconic properties. I was wondering if you might be interested in contributing to the series. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, living in one of Boston's most historic houses, being invited to write about the hidden stories of similar properties. That sounds fascinating, Ms. Martinez. I'd love to learn more about the project. Wonderful. Would you be available to meet for lunch next week? I'd like to discuss the scope of the series and see if there's a good fit between your interests and our editorial vision. As we arranged the details of our meeting, I felt a sense of rightness about the direction my life was taking. This was the kind of work I had always wanted to do, writing that combined my love of history and architecture with my passion for storytelling. After hanging up, I sat in the library surrounded by Aunt Millicent's books and felt her presence in a way I hadn't before. She had created this space not just as a sanctuary for herself, but as a foundation for someone else to build upon. The inheritance wasn't just about financial security. It was about providing me with the stability and confidence I needed to pursue opportunities like this one. That evening, I decided to host my first dinner party in the house. I invited Mrs. Chen to join me, along with Mr. Patterson and Maria, the other staff members who had cared for Aunt Millicent and were now caring for me. It felt important to acknowledge that we were building something together, that this house would continue to be a place where people felt valued and appreciated. We dined in the formal dining room, using Aunt Millicent's china and crystal, surrounded by the oil paintings she had collected during her travels. Mr. Patterson, a quiet man in his 70s, told stories about Aunt Millicent's gardening projects and her determination to grow roses that would bloom from spring through fall. Maria, who was probably in her 50s but looked younger, shared memories of helping Aunt Millicent prepare for the salons she used to host, elaborate gatherings that brought together artists and intellectuals from across New England. She always said this house was meant to be filled with conversation and laughter, Maria explained. She didn't want it to be a museum, but a living space where creativity could flourish. As I listened to their stories, I began to understand more fully what Aunt Millicent had envisioned for this inheritance. She hadn't just given me a house. She had given me a legacy to continue, a tradition of supporting artists and fostering creative community. The next few days passed peacefully, as I settled into routines that felt more natural than anything I had experienced in years. I wrote in the mornings, taking advantage of the inspiring environment and the freedom from financial pressure. I spent afternoons exploring the city, rediscovering neighborhoods and landmarks with the fresh perspective that came from my changed circumstances. I spent evenings reading in the library, working my way through Aunt Millicent's collection and discovering authors I had never encountered. It was during one of these evening reading sessions that I received another unexpected phone call. This time the caller ID showed Marcus's office number, which I hadn't thought to block. "Sarah, thank God you answered." Marcus sounded genuinely relieved to reach me. "I've been trying to call you for days. I told you my number had changed." I kept my voice neutral, offering no explanation for why he had been unable to reach me. "Sarah, we need to talk. There are legal issues we need to discuss, paperwork that needs to be signed. You can't just disappear like this." "What legal issues?" As far as I knew, we had no shared debts or joint accounts that required immediate attention. "The divorce, Sarah. We need to file papers, divide assets, work out the details. This can't just be left hanging indefinitely." I found his sudden urgency about the divorce interesting, especially since he had been the one demanding it in the first place. I suspected that Emma and Jake had reported back about my living situation, and Marcus was now calculating how much money might be at stake. "I'm happy to proceed with the divorce, Marcus. Have your lawyer send me whatever papers need to be signed. It's not that simple. We need to discuss asset division, alimony, all the financial arrangements. My lawyer says we should meet in person to work out the details. There was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't just about legal formalities. Marcus was fishing for information, trying to understand the scope of my financial situation so he could position himself advantageously in divorce proceedings. Marcus, we don't have significant shared assets. The studio apartment was a rental, we don't own any property together, and our bank accounts have always been separate. This should be fairly straightforward. But what about your inheritance? He tried to sound casual, but his interest was obvious. The kids mentioned that you're living in some kind of family property now. Depending on when you received it and how it's structured, it might be considered marital property. The audacity of his statement was breathtaking. Marcus was actually suggesting that he might be entitled to a portion of Aunt Millicent's inheritance, money, and property that had nothing to do with our marriage or his contributions to our household. My inheritance is completely separate from our marriage, Marcus. It was left to me personally, and you have no claim to any part of it. Sarah, you're not a lawyer. You don't understand how these things work. Community property laws can be complicated, especially when large sums are involved. I felt a flash of anger at his condescending tone, his assumption that I was too naive to understand my own legal situation. This was the same man who had dismissed my intelligence and capabilities for years, and he was still doing it even after I had clearly moved beyond his influence. Actually, Marcus, I've already consulted with an attorney about the inheritance. Everything is properly structured and completely protected. You won't be seeing a penny of it. The line was quiet for a long moment, and I could almost hear Marcus recalculating his strategy. Sarah, I think we should meet in person to discuss this. There are obviously some misunderstandings that need to be cleared up. Why don't you come by the apartment tomorrow evening? We can talk privately, work things out like adults. The suggestion that I should come to him, that I should return to the cramped studio apartment where he had rejected me, revealed how little he understood about the shift in our dynamic. Marcus was still thinking like the person with power in our relationship, still assuming that he could summon me when it was convenient for him. That won't be necessary, Marcus. Have your lawyer contact my lawyer if there are any legitimate legal issues that need to be resolved. Who's your lawyer? His voice had taken on a sharper edge, the tone he used when he wasn't getting his way. Theodore Pemberton of Pemberton, Chase & Associates. I heard Marcus's sharp intake of breath. Pemberton was one of the most expensive and prestigious attorneys in Boston, not someone that a struggling freelance writer should have been able to afford. Sarah, how are you paying for Theodore Pemberton? His rates start at $800 an hour. That's really not your concern anymore, Marcus. Before he could respond, I hung up and immediately blocked his office number as well. I had no intention of continuing these conversations that served no purpose other than to feed his curiosity and his greed. The next morning, I called Mr. Pemberton's office to give him a heads up about Marcus's likely attempts to contact him. The conversation was brief and professional, with Mr. Pemberton assuring me that he would handle any inquiries appropriately and that my inheritance was completely protected from any claims Marcus might attempt to make. That afternoon, I had my lunch meeting with Rebecca Martinez at a charming bistro in the Back Bay. She was exactly what I had expected from her reputation: intelligent, articulate, and genuinely passionate about literary journalism. We spent 2 hours discussing the Hidden Histories project, and by the end of our conversation, she had offered me a contract to write 3 articles for the series. The assignment was perfect for my current circumstances. I would be researching and writing about historic Boston properties, their original owners, and the stories that had shaped their development over time. The work would allow me to combine my love of history and architecture with my writing skills, and the payment was generous enough to support my lifestyle even without the inheritance. Walking home from lunch, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction about the direction my life was taking. I was living in a beautiful house that inspired me daily, I was working on projects that excited and challenged me, and I was free from relationships that had diminished rather than enhanced my sense of self-worth. As I approached 47 Beacon Street, I noticed a familiar figure standing on the sidewalk in front of the house. Marcus was there, dressed in his best suit, clearly waiting for me to return home. His expression was a mixture of determination and something that might have been desperation. "Hello, Marcus." I kept my voice polite but distant. "What brings you to the neighborhood?" He gestured toward the mansion behind him, his eyes wide with something that looked like hunger. "Sarah, we need to talk. I had no idea about any of this when we discussed our situation last week. This changes everything. The house is beautiful, isn't it?" I moved past him toward the front steps, making it clear that this conversation would be brief. "Sarah, please, can we go inside and talk privately? There are things I need to say, things I should have said before." I turned to face him, noting how his expensive suit couldn't disguise the desperation in his posture. "Marcus, you made your feelings very clear last week. You told me there wasn't room for me in your new life, remember? I was under stress. The pressure from the kids, the financial concerns about the new house, I wasn't thinking clearly." He stepped closer, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he used with difficult clients. "Sarah, we've been together for 8 years. That has to count for something." The irony of hearing almost the exact same words that Emma had used wasn't lost on me. When it was convenient, family relationships mattered. When it wasn't, they were disposable. "You're right, Marcus. 8 years should count for something. 8 years of my contributions to your household, my support for your career, my care for your children. 8 years of compromise and accommodation, and trying to be the person you wanted me to be." "Exactly." Marcus smiled, thinking he was making progress. "We built something together, Sarah. We can rebuild it, make it even better than before." "No, Marcus. What we built was a relationship where my value was contingent on my usefulness to you. The moment you decided I was more burden than benefit, you discarded me without hesitation." His smile faded as he realized I wasn't going to be as easily manipulated as he had hoped. "Sarah, I know I hurt you. I handled the whole situation badly, and I'm sorry. But we can work through this. Think about what we could accomplish together now that financial pressure isn't an issue." There it was, the real reason for his sudden change of heart. Marcus wasn't apologizing because he had realized he loved me. He was apologizing because he had realized I was wealthy. "Marcus, if you had known about my inheritance last week, would you have handled things differently?" He hesitated just long enough to reveal the truth. "Of course I would have. Sarah, I would never have suggested that you move out if I had known about your family's wealth." His honesty was refreshing, even if it was damning. Marcus was openly admitting that his treatment of me had been based purely on his assessment of my financial value. "So you're not apologizing because you realize you treated me poorly. You're apologizing because you realize you made a miscalculation. Sarah, that's not fair. I love you. I've always loved you." The words felt hollow, performative, like lines he had rehearsed on the drive over. "Marcus, if you loved me, you would have valued my contributions to our relationship regardless of their monetary worth. If you loved me, you wouldn't have dismissed my career as a hobby or my dreams as impractical. If you loved me, you would have defended me when your children treated me with disrespect." He opened his mouth to argue, but I held up my hand to stop him. "The truth is, Marcus, you loved the convenience of me. You loved having someone to manage your household and care for your children while you focused on your career. But you never loved me as an equal partner, and you certainly never respected me as an individual. Sarah, please." His voice was becoming more desperate as he realized his usual charm wasn't working. "We can start over. We can build a new kind of relationship, one based on true partnership." I looked at this man I had once loved, this person who had shared my bed and my life for 8 years, and felt nothing but pity for his inability to understand what he had lost. "Marcus, I am starting over, but I'm doing it without you." I walked up the steps to my front door, leaving him standing on the sidewalk. As I put my key in the lock, I heard him call after me. "Sarah, you're making a mistake. You'll regret this when you realize what you're giving up." I turned back one final time, looking down at him from the elevated position of my front steps. "Marcus, the only thing I regret is not realizing my own worth sooner." Inside the house, I watched from the library window as Marcus stood on the sidewalk for several more minutes, staring up at the mansion with an expression of frustrated longing. Finally, he got into his car and drove away, but I had a feeling this wouldn't be the last attempt he would make to insinuate himself back into my life. Mrs. Chen appeared with tea and a sympathetic expression. "Difficult conversation?" "Very predictable conversation," I corrected. "Some people only value what they think they can't have." That evening, as I sat in the library working on my first article for Metropolitan magazine, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. A week ago, I had been living in a cramped apartment with people who saw me as a burden. Tonight, I was writing in a room that had been home to generations of books and ideas, surrounded by beauty and possibility. The transition hadn't been without emotional challenges, but I was beginning to understand that Aunt Millicent's gift had been about more than financial security. She had given me the confidence to see myself as someone worthy of respect and consideration, someone whose dreams and aspirations had value regardless of their immediate profitability. I was no longer the woman who had apologized for taking up space, or who had minimized her own contributions to avoid conflict. I was becoming someone who understood her own worth and refused to accept less than she deserved from the people in her life. As I wrote about the hidden histories of Boston's grand houses, I realized I was also documenting my own transformation, my own journey from invisibility to significance. The house around me wasn't just a setting for my new life. It was a symbol of what became possible when someone believed in your potential enough to give you the tools to realize it. Outside my window, the lights of Beacon Hill twinkled like stars, and I felt a deep sense of belonging to this place and this moment. I was exactly where I was meant to be. The next few weeks settled into a rhythm that felt more natural than anything I had experienced in years. My mornings were spent writing in the library, where the combination of natural light and literary atmosphere seemed to unlock creativity I hadn't accessed before. The articles for Metropolitan magazine were flowing easily, each one revealing fascinating stories about Boston's architectural treasures and the families who had shaped them. My first piece focused on a Victorian mansion in the South End that had served as a station on the Underground Railroad. The research required visits to historical archives and interviews with descendants of the original owners, work that felt meaningful in ways my previous assignments never had. Rebecca Martinez was thrilled with the draft, calling it exactly the kind of narrative journalism she hoped the series would showcase. The financial freedom that came with the inheritance allowed me to be selective about additional work, accepting only projects that genuinely interested me rather than taking whatever paid the bills. I was rediscovering the passion that had originally drawn me to writing, the excitement of uncovering stories that needed to be told. During my afternoon walks through the neighborhood, I began to feel like a true resident of Beacon Hill, rather than an imposter who had somehow gained access to a world where she didn't belong. The other residents nodded politely when we passed on the sidewalk, and gradually some began stopping for brief conversations about the weather or local happenings. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, who lived in the equally impressive mansion next door, was particularly welcoming. She was probably in her 80s, with silver hair always perfectly styled and clothes that suggested both wealth and taste. She had known Aunt Millicent for decades and was delighted to share stories about their friendship. "Your great-aunt was quite remarkable," she told me during one of our garden conversations. "She refused to let anyone dictate how she should live her life, which was revolutionary for a woman of her generation. She used to say that conformity was the enemy of authenticity." Mrs. Hartwell also provided context about the neighborhood dynamics that I was still learning to navigate. Beacon Hill had its own social ecosystem, she explained, with traditions and expectations that weren't immediately obvious to newcomers. "The key is to be yourself while respecting the community's history," she advised. Your great-aunt understood that balance perfectly. She was unconventional, but never inconsiderate. One afternoon, while I was working in the garden that Mr. Patterson had been teaching me to maintain, I noticed a familiar car parked across the street. Emma was sitting in the driver's seat, clearly watching the house. She had been there for at least an hour, making no attempt to approach or announce her presence. I continued pruning the roses that had been Aunt Millicent's pride, occasionally glancing toward the car but making no acknowledgement of Emma's surveillance. After another 30 minutes, she finally got out of the car and walked across the street. "Sarah, can we talk?" Her voice was more subdued than usual, lacking the sharp edge of entitlement I had grown accustomed to. "Of course, Emma. Would you like to come inside, or would you prefer to talk in the garden?" She glanced toward the house with obvious longing before shaking her head. "The garden is fine." We sat on the wrought iron bench that overlooked Aunt Millicent's prize-winning rose bushes. Emma was fidgeting with her phone, clearly struggling with whatever she had come to say. "I owe you an apology," she finally began. "The way I treated you, The things I said, they were wrong. I was so focused on what I thought I deserved that I didn't think about how my words would hurt you. The apology seemed genuine, though I suspected it was motivated at least partially by the realization that I was no longer the powerless figure she had dismissed so casually. I appreciate that, Emma. It takes courage to admit when we've made mistakes. She looked around the garden, taking in the carefully maintained flower beds and the elegant outdoor furniture. I keep thinking about how different things could have been if we had known about all this. If Dad had known you were wealthy, he never would have asked you to leave. The comment revealed that Emma still didn't fully understand what had gone wrong in our family dynamic. She was focusing on the financial aspects rather than the fundamental issues of respect and consideration. Emma, the problem wasn't that your father didn't know about my inheritance. The problem was that he only valued me for what I could provide to his household, and when he decided I wasn't providing enough, he was willing to discard me. But you were family, she protested. You lived with us for 3 years. That should have counted for something, regardless of money. I was encouraged by her recognition that family relationships should transcend financial considerations, but I could see she was still struggling to understand the full scope of what had happened. You're right that it should have counted for something. But when your father was making his decision about the new house, he didn't consider my feelings or my contributions to our household. He simply calculated that his life would be more convenient without me. Emma was quiet for several minutes, apparently processing this perspective. Finally, she spoke again, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. I think I understand now why you don't want to come back. Dad has been talking about the divorce like it's just a business transaction, dividing up assets and calculating costs. He doesn't seem sad about losing you, just frustrated about the legal complications. Her observation was perceptive and probably accurate. Marcus had always been pragmatic about relationships, treating them as partnerships that should deliver measurable benefits rather than sources of emotional fulfillment. I'm building a new life now, Emma, one where I'm valued for who I am rather than what I can provide to someone else. It's healthier for everyone this way. She nodded slowly, though I could see she was still processing the implications of our conversation. Sarah, I know I don't have any right to ask this, but would it be possible for us to stay in touch? I know I was horrible to you, but you were the closest thing to a real mother figure I've had since my mom moved away. The request caught me off guard. Despite everything that had happened, despite the cruel things she had said, there was something vulnerable and genuine in her voice that reminded me of the better moments we had shared. Emma, I care about you and Jake, but any relationship we have going forward needs to be separate from your father. I won't be drawn back into family dynamics that don't serve anyone well. I understand, she said quickly. I miss having someone to talk to about college applications and future plans. Dad doesn't really listen when I try to discuss those things with him. The admission revealed something important about the family dynamics I had left behind. Marcus was focused on providing material support for his children, but he wasn't offering the emotional guidance they needed as they transitioned to adulthood. We can stay in touch, Emma, but with clear boundaries. I'm not going to be available to mediate conflicts between you and your father, and I won't discuss my relationship with him or the divorce proceedings. She agreed eagerly, and we exchanged contact information before she left. Watching her drive away, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. I was glad she had apologized and that we might maintain some kind of relationship, but I was also aware that I needed to be careful not to be drawn back into patterns that had been harmful before. The following week brought an unexpected development. I received a call from a local television producer named Janet Morrison, who was developing a documentary series about historic Boston neighborhoods. She had read my Metropolitan magazine articles and was interested in interviewing me about my research methodology and my insights into the city's architectural heritage. The prospect of appearing on television was both exciting and nerve-wracking. I had never considered myself particularly camera-ready, but Janet assured me that the interview would focus on substance rather than performance. We're looking for experts who can help viewers understand the stories behind these beautiful buildings, she explained during our preliminary phone conversation. Your writing demonstrates exactly the kind of narrative approach we want to showcase. The interview was scheduled to take place at my house, which Janet felt would provide an ideal backdrop for discussing the intersection of personal and historical narratives. As the date approached, I found myself both anticipating and dreading the exposure that would come with appearing on television. Mrs. Chen helped me prepare by arranging flowers throughout the rooms where filming would take place and ensuring that every surface was spotless. Mr. Patterson trimmed the garden to perfection, creating a backdrop that would showcase Aunt Millicent's horticultural legacy. The morning of the filming, I woke up early and spent extra time getting ready. I had purchased a new outfit for the occasion, a sophisticated dress in deep blue that conveyed both professionalism and confidence. As I applied makeup and styled my hair, I reflected on how much my self-image had changed over the past month. The woman looking back at me from the mirror was someone I barely recognized from my previous life. She stood straighter, spoke with more authority, and carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from knowing her own worth. Janet Morrison arrived with a small crew that included a camera operator and a sound technician. She was probably in her 40s, with the kind of energetic professionalism that suggested extensive experience in television production. "Sarah, this house is absolutely stunning," she said as we walked through the main floor. "The architectural details are exactly what we hope to showcase in the series." The interview itself lasted about 2 hours, with Janet asking thoughtful questions about my research process, my insights into Boston's development patterns, and my thoughts about the relationship between preservation and progress. I found myself speaking with confidence about topics I was passionate about, explaining complex historical concepts in ways that would be accessible to television audiences. When we moved outside to film in the garden, Janet asked about my personal connection to the house and neighborhood. I explained about inheriting the property from Aunt Millicent, sharing some of the stories that Mrs. Chen and the other staff members had told me about her unconventional life. "It sounds like your great-aunt was quite remarkable," Janet observed, a woman who lived entirely on her own terms, which couldn't have been easy in her era. She was ahead of her time in many ways. She understood that authentic living sometimes requires choices that others might not understand or approve of. After the crew finished filming and packing their equipment, Janet lingered for a few minutes to discuss the broadcast schedule and the promotional strategy for the series. "Sarah, I have to tell you, this was one of the most engaging interviews we've conducted for this project. You have a natural ability to make complex topics accessible and interesting." The compliment meant more to me than she probably realized. For years, I had struggled with confidence about my abilities as a communicator, second-guessing myself and minimizing my expertise. Janet's feedback was confirmation that I had been underestimating my own talents. The television interview was scheduled to air in 3 weeks, which gave me time to prepare for whatever response it might generate. I mentioned the upcoming broadcast to Mrs. Hartwell during one of our garden conversations, and she was thrilled by the prospect of having the neighborhood featured on television. "Your great-aunt would be so proud," she said. "She always believed that these houses had stories worth sharing with the world." A few days before the interview was scheduled to air, I received an unexpected phone call from my mother in Florida. We spoke regularly, but she usually called on Sundays, so a midweek call was unusual. "Sarah, honey, I just got the most interesting phone call from your cousin Linda in Boston. She said she saw a preview for some documentary about historic neighborhoods, and she thought she saw you in it. Is that possible? I had forgotten that several relatives lived in the Boston area and might see the television interview." The prospect of explaining my changed circumstances to extended family was daunting, especially since most of them knew nothing about my divorce or my inheritance. "Yes, Mom, I was interviewed for a documentary series about Boston architecture. They featured the house I'm living in now." "What house, sweetheart?" "I thought you and Marcus were still in that little apartment." The conversation that followed required careful navigation. I explained about the divorce and the inheritance, trying to provide enough information to satisfy my mother's curiosity without overwhelming her with details she didn't need. "Millicent left you her house?" My mother's voice carried a mixture of surprise and excitement. "Sarah, that's wonderful news. I always knew she was fond of you, but I had no idea she was planning something like this." My mother had known Aunt Millicent better than I had, having grown up hearing stories about her eccentric adventures and unconventional choices. She was able to provide context about the family dynamics that had shaped Aunt Millicent's decision to remain unmarried and childless. She used to say that marriage would require too many compromises to her independence, my mother explained. She wanted to travel and collect art and support young artists, and she felt that those goals would be difficult to pursue within the constraints of traditional family life. The conversation with my mother helped me understand more fully why Aunt Millicent had chosen me as her heir. She had seen in me someone who was struggling with similar tensions between personal fulfillment and social expectations, someone who might benefit from the kind of freedom she had created for herself. The documentary aired on a Thursday evening, and I watched it from the comfort of my library, surrounded by the books and artifacts that had provided the backdrop for my interview. Seeing myself on television was surreal, but I was pleased with how the segment had been edited. Janet had skillfully woven together my comments about architectural history with beautiful shots of the house and garden, creating a narrative that was both informative and visually compelling. The response to the broadcast was immediate and overwhelming. My phone began ringing within minutes of the show ending, with calls from friends, colleagues, and even strangers who had tracked down my contact information. Rebecca Martinez called to congratulate me on what she called a breakthrough media appearance that would undoubtedly raise my profile as a writer and historian. "Sarah, you were absolutely brilliant," she said. "You managed to be both authoritative and approachable, which is exactly the combination that makes for effective television communication." Several other editors and producers reached out over the following days, interested in commissioning articles or exploring collaboration opportunities. The exposure had opened doors that might have remained closed for years under different circumstances. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. On Saturday morning, while I was having coffee in the garden, Mrs. Chen announced that I had a visitor. Marcus was standing in the foyer, but this time his demeanor was different. Gone was the desperate charm of his previous visit, replaced by something that looked more like genuine humility. "Sarah, thank you for agreeing to see me. I know I don't deserve your time, but there are things I need to say." I led him to the formal sitting room, choosing a setting that would maintain appropriate distance while allowing for conversation. "I saw the documentary," he began. "Watching you speak so confidently about your work, seeing you in this beautiful house, it made me realize how much I underestimated you during our marriage." The admission was more honest than anything he had said during our previous encounters. "Marcus, I appreciate your acknowledgement, but I'm not sure what you hope to accomplish with this conversation." He took a deep breath before continuing. "I want to apologize, truly apologize, for the way I treated you. Not just during the divorce, but throughout our relationship. I diminished your contributions, dismissed your dreams, and made you feel like you weren't enough. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." The apology seemed genuine, but I was cautious about accepting it at face value. Marcus was skilled at saying what people wanted to hear when it served his purposes. "What prompted this change of perspective?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment, apparently gathering his thoughts. "After the documentary aired, Emma asked me why I had never been as supportive of your career as I was of my own. She pointed out that I used to brag about my professional achievements while treating your writing like a hobby. It made me realize how much damage I had done to your confidence over the years." The fact that Emma had been the catalyst for his self-reflection was both surprising and encouraging. It suggested that our conversation in the garden had prompted her to examine the family dynamics more critically. I also realized that I was so focused on what I thought success should look like that I never appreciated the success you were actually achieving. Your writing, your research, your ability to make complex topics accessible, those are real talents that I should have celebrated instead of minimized. His words were hitting closer to the truth of what had gone wrong in our relationship than anything he had said before. "Marcus, I'm glad you're beginning to understand these things, but recognition after the fact doesn't undo years of feeling unsupported and undervalued. You're absolutely right, and I'm not here to ask for forgiveness or to try to repair what I broke. I just wanted you to know that I see now how wrong I was, and that the failure of our marriage was my responsibility, not yours." The conversation continued for about an hour, with Marcus acknowledging specific instances where he had undermined my confidence or prioritized his own needs over mine. While I appreciated his honesty, I was also aware that this newfound insight had come only after he had seen evidence of my success and independence. Before he left, Marcus made one final statement that surprised me with its sincerity. "Sarah, I hope you find someone who appreciates you from the beginning, who supports your dreams instead of trying to reshape them. You deserve the kind of partnership I was never capable of providing." After he left, I sat in the garden reflecting on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. A month ago, I had been married to a man who saw me as an inconvenience. Today, that same man was acknowledging my worth and encouraging me to find better relationships in the future. The transformation wasn't really about Marcus's change of perspective, though. It was about my own recognition of what I deserved from the people in my life. Aunt Millicent's inheritance had given me more than financial security. It had given me the confidence to see myself as someone worthy of respect and consideration. That afternoon, while I was working on my latest article for Metropolitan magazine, I received a phone call that would prove to be pivotal. The caller identified himself as Dr. James Harrison, a professor of American Studies at Harvard University. "Ms. Ashworth, I hope you don't mind the unsolicited call. I saw your interview in the documentary series, and I was impressed by your insights into Boston's architectural heritage. I'm calling because our department is developing a new program focused on public humanities, and we're looking for practitioners who can bridge academic research and popular communication." The conversation that followed was one of the most intellectually stimulating I had experienced in years. Dr. Harrison explained that Harvard was launching an initiative designed to make scholarly research more accessible to general audiences, using digital media and community engagement to share academic insights beyond traditional university settings. "Your work with Metropolitan magazine and your television interview demonstrate exactly the kind of skills we're hoping to cultivate in our students," he explained. "We're wondering if you might be interested in teaching a course on narrative journalism and public history." The offer was both flattering and intimidating. Teaching at Harvard had never been part of my career aspirations, largely because I had never considered myself qualified for such a position. But Dr. Harrison seemed convinced that my combination of writing skills and historical knowledge made me an ideal candidate for their program. The position would be part-time, allowing me to continue my freelance writing while contributing to academic conversations about the role of humanities in public discourse. The salary was generous, but more importantly, the work would align perfectly with my interests and expertise. "I don't have a PhD," I pointed out. "Most university positions require advanced degrees that I don't possess." Dr. Harrison laughed. "Miss Ashworth, you have something more valuable than additional letters after your name. You have demonstrated ability to make academic concepts accessible to diverse audiences. That's exactly what our program is designed to cultivate." I asked for time to consider the offer, and Dr. Harrison agreed to send me detailed information about the curriculum and expectations. After hanging up, I sat in my library surrounded by the books that had shaped my intellectual development, trying to process the possibility that I might soon be contributing to similar conversations at one of the world's most prestigious universities. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being offered academic opportunities just months after Marcus had dismissed my career as impractical and unprofitable. The recognition from Harvard suggested that my work had value beyond whatever financial returns it generated, that the passion and expertise I had been developing over years of freelance writing had real significance in academic and cultural contexts. That evening, Emma called to congratulate me on the documentary and to share some news of her own. She had been accepted to several prestigious universities for the following fall, including her top choice of Northwestern University in Chicago. "Sarah, I wanted you to be one of the first people to know about Northwestern. I know we talked about your helping me with college applications before everything fell apart, and I wanted you to know that your advice was really important to my success." The call was both touching and bittersweet. I was genuinely proud of Emma's achievements, but I was also aware that our relationship would necessarily be different going forward. "I'm so proud of you, Emma. Northwestern has an excellent journalism program, which I think will be perfect for your interests and abilities." She asked about the documentary and my other recent projects, showing genuine interest in my work for the first time since I had known her. The conversation felt more like an exchange between equals, rather than the patronizing dynamic that had characterized our previous interactions. Before ending the call, Emma made a request that surprised me. "Sarah, would it be possible for me to visit you sometime before I leave for college? I'd love to see your house and maybe get some advice about managing independence and building confidence. I feel like I have a lot to learn about standing up for myself and making my own decisions." The request suggested that Emma was beginning to understand some of the lessons I had learned through my own transformation. I agreed to the visit, curious about what insights she might be seeking and what wisdom I might be able to share. The next few weeks brought a steady stream of opportunities and invitations that confirmed the momentum my career was gaining. In addition to the Harvard teaching position, which I had decided to accept, I received offers to speak at conferences, contribute to anthologies, and consult on documentary projects. The financial freedom provided by Aunt Millicent's inheritance meant that I could be selective about these opportunities, choosing projects that genuinely excited me rather than accepting whatever paid the bills. This selectivity seemed to enhance rather than limit my prospects, as people began to associate my name with quality work rather than desperation for assignments. Emma's visit took place on a warm Saturday in late summer. She arrived looking more mature than I remembered, dressed in clothes that suggested growing confidence in her own style rather than slavish adherence to current trends. I gave her a tour of the house, sharing stories about Aunt Millicent and explaining some of the historical significance of the architectural details. Emma was particularly fascinated by the library and the artist's studio on the 4th floor. "This is incredible," she said as we stood in the studio surrounded by easels and art supplies. "To have a space dedicated entirely to creativity, where you can work on projects just because they interest you rather than because they pay the bills." Her observation reflected a growing understanding of the relationship between financial security and creative freedom that I had been discovering myself. We spent the afternoon in the garden, where Emma asked thoughtful questions about building confidence, making difficult decisions, and navigating relationships that didn't serve her growth. It was clear that she had been reflecting seriously on the family dynamics she was preparing to leave behind. "I keep thinking about how you managed to walk away from a situation that wasn't working, even though it meant giving up financial security and facing uncertainty about the future," she said. "I don't know if I would have that kind of courage." Emma, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to act in alignment with your values even when you're scared. The inheritance made my transition easier, but the decision to leave had to come from understanding my own worth. She nodded thoughtfully, clearly processing the implications of this perspective. "I think I've been too focused on avoiding conflict and keeping everyone happy," she admitted. "But watching how that affected you, and seeing how much happier you are now, it's making me realize that some conflicts are worth having if they lead to authentic relationships." Our conversation continued until evening, ranging from practical concerns about college life to deeper questions about building meaningful relationships and pursuing personal fulfillment. By the time Emma left, I felt that we had established a new foundation for our relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than familial obligation. The fall semester at Harvard began in September, and I found myself walking through the iconic campus with a mixture of excitement and intimidation. The students in my narrative journalism course were bright and engaged, eager to learn techniques for making academic research accessible to broader audiences. Teaching required skills I had never formally developed, but I discovered that years of explaining complex topics in my writing had prepared me well for the classroom environment. My students responded enthusiastically to assignments that challenged them to find compelling narratives within historical research, and several produced work that was genuinely publishable. The academic environment also provided opportunities for intellectual growth that I hadn't anticipated. Conversations with colleagues introduced me to new perspectives on history, media, and public engagement that enriched my own writing and thinking. Dr. Harrison proved to be an ideal mentor, offering guidance about navigating university politics while encouraging me to maintain the fresh perspective that had attracted his attention in the first place. "You bring something unique to our department," he told me during one of our regular check-in meetings. "Academic writing tends toward jargon and abstraction, but you demonstrate that scholarly insights can be both rigorous and readable." By November, my life had settled into rhythms that felt both productive and fulfilling. My mornings were often spent writing at home, taking advantage of the inspiring environment and freedom from external pressures. 2 afternoons a week were devoted to teaching at Harvard, work that was intellectually stimulating and professionally rewarding. Evenings were frequently filled with cultural events, dinner parties with other writers and academics, or simply quiet reading in my library. The social isolation that had characterized my marriage to Marcus had been replaced by a rich network of relationships with people who shared my interests and values. Mrs. Hartwell had introduced me to several other Beacon Hill residents who became friends rather than mere neighbors. My colleagues at Harvard included me in their social gatherings, treating me as an equal rather than an outsider trying to prove her worth. Most importantly, I had developed a relationship with myself that was based on respect rather than criticism. The constant self-doubt that had plagued me during my marriage had been replaced by confidence in my abilities and trust in my judgment. One crisp December morning, while I was working in the library, Mrs. Chen announced that I had an unexpected visitor. A young woman was standing in the foyer, probably in her mid-20s, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed somehow familiar. "Miss Ashworth? I'm Julia Brennan. I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit, but I've been trying to work up the courage to contact you for weeks." The name didn't immediately register, but there was something about her manner that suggested our meeting was significant in ways I didn't yet understand. "Please call me Sarah." "How can I help you, Julia?" She took a deep breath before continuing. "I'm a graduate student at Emerson College, working on my thesis about women artists and collectors in early 20th century Boston. During my research, I discovered that your great-aunt Millicent was one of the most important patrons of emerging artists in New England during the 1950s and 60s. The information wasn't entirely surprising, given what I had learned about Aunt Millicent's interests and values, but I was curious about Julia's specific research focus. I was wondering if you might be willing to share some information about her collection and her relationships with the artists she supported. My thesis advisor thinks there might be enough material for a biography, but I need access to primary sources to make the project viable." The request was both flattering and overwhelming. I had been thinking about ways to honor Aunt Millicent's legacy, but I hadn't considered the possibility that her life and work might be worthy of scholarly attention. "Julia, I'd be happy to help with your research, but I should warn you that I didn't know my great-aunt well personally. Most of what I've learned about her life has come from the staff here, and from documents I've found in the house." "Actually, that might be perfect," she replied enthusiastically. "Sometimes family members are too close to their subjects to see them objectively. And if you've been living in her house and working with her staff, you probably have access to materials that other researchers would never see." We spent the next 2 hours discussing Julia's research methodology and the scope of her project. She had already identified several artists whose careers had been significantly influenced by Aunt Millicent's support, and she was particularly interested in understanding how a single woman had managed to exercise such influence in a male-dominated art world. "Your great-aunt was apparently quite strategic about using her financial independence to create opportunities for artists who might not have found support through traditional channels," Julia explained. "She was especially committed to supporting women artists and artists of color, who faced additional barriers to recognition." The conversation revealed dimensions of Aunt Millicent's life that I had never fully understood. She hadn't just been an eccentric collector. She had been a serious patron who had used her resources to advance social justice causes through arts funding. Julia's research also provided context for some of the artifacts I had found throughout the house. Letters from grateful artists, exhibition catalogs from galleries that Aunt Millicent had helped fund, newspaper clippings about art shows that she had sponsored all suddenly made more sense within the framework of a systematic effort to reshape the cultural landscape. We agreed that Julia would return the following week to begin examining Aunt Millicent's papers more systematically. In the meantime, I spent several days going through boxes and filing cabinets that I had previously ignored, discovering evidence of a philanthropic legacy that was far more extensive than I had realized. The collaboration with Julia became one of the most rewarding aspects of my new life. Working together to document Aunt Millicent's contributions to Boston's cultural heritage felt like a natural extension of my own interests in historical research and narrative journalism. More importantly, the project helped me understand more fully why Aunt Millicent had chosen me as her heir. She hadn't just been leaving me property and financial security, she had been entrusting me with the continuation of her values and commitments. As 2024 drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary transformation that had defined the year. 12 months earlier, I had been living in a cramped apartment with people who saw me as a burden rather than a partner. I had been struggling to make ends meet while pursuing a career that others dismissed as impractical. Now I was living in one of Boston's most beautiful houses, teaching at Harvard University, and collaborating on research that would preserve an important legacy of arts patronage. Most importantly, I had learned to value myself enough to refuse relationships and opportunities that didn't serve my growth. The inheritance from Aunt Millicent had provided the foundation for this transformation, but the real change had come from recognizing my own worth and refusing to accept less than I deserved from the people in my life. On New Year's Eve, I hosted a small dinner party for the friends I had made over the past year. Mrs. Hartwell, Rebecca Martinez, Dr. Harrison, Julia Brennan, and several other colleagues and neighbors gathered in the formal dining room where Aunt Millicent had once entertained artists and intellectuals. As we raised our glasses to toast the coming year, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. The woman who had been dismissed as a broke housewife had discovered that she was actually a respected scholar, successful writer, and valued friend. The house around us, with its elegant rooms and artistic treasures, was no longer just an inheritance, but a home where creativity and intellectual curiosity were valued above material convenience. The life I was building felt authentic in ways that my previous existence never had. Emma, who was home from Northwestern for winter break, had asked to attend the dinner party. She was thriving in college, discovering her own voice as a writer, and developing confidence that would serve her well in whatever career she chose to pursue. "Sarah," she said as the evening was winding down, "I want you to know that watching your transformation has been one of the most important lessons of my life. You showed me that it's possible to start over, that we don't have to accept situations that diminish us just because they're familiar or convenient." Her words meant more to me than she probably realized. If my journey had helped one young woman understand her own worth and potential, then all the pain and uncertainty of the past year had been worthwhile. As my guests departed and Mrs. Chen began clearing the dishes, I stood in the library looking out at the snow-covered garden where Aunt Millicent's roses lay dormant, waiting for spring's return. In a few months, they would bloom again, continuing a cycle of beauty that had persisted for decades. Like those roses, I had experienced a period of dormancy, a time when my potential was hidden beneath circumstances that didn't allow for growth. But given the right conditions, the right soil, the right amount of light and care, I had been able to flourish in ways I had never imagined possible. The house that Marcus had once called his dream home had become the foundation for dreams he could never have envisioned. It had become a place where authenticity was valued over conformity, where creativity was supported rather than dismissed, where one woman's courage to live on her own terms had created opportunities for others to do the same. As I climbed the grand staircase to my bedroom, I passed the portrait of Aunt Millicent that hung in the second-floor hallway. In the painting, she was probably in her 40s, dressed elegantly but simply, with eyes that suggested both intelligence and determination. "Thank you," I whispered to the portrait. "Thank you for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Thank you for giving me the tools to build the life I was meant to live." The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the master bedroom, illuminating a space that had become truly mine. Outside, the city was beginning another year, full of possibilities and opportunities that I was finally equipped to embrace. I had learned that being called crazy by people who couldn't understand your vision was often a sign that you were moving in the right direction. I had discovered that inheriting someone else's dream house was less important than building your own dream life. Most significantly, I had realized that the greatest inheritance isn't money or property, but the confidence to believe in your own worth, and the courage to insist that others recognize it too. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.